Package Not Delivered. Written by M48 Patton. Published on the 19th of September 2019. Chapter 1. The Hard Part. Once, there was an old shack on the edge of a dirty, dark little town deep in what is now known as the Diamond Dog Confederation. Newly laid rails passed by the old shack, carrying gleaming new trains imported from Equestria, hauling loads of fresh ore, gold, and crystals from the town's mine to some far-off land that the dogs of Bad Rock could only dream of. Should any creature look out of one of those trains at that old shack, they would be surprised to see that the shack was, in fact, the town post office. If, by chance, one was to ride the morning train, they would see a grey diamond dog with an eternal frown shuffle from the post office carrying a brown sack. Some would notice the small brown cap of an equestrian post worker adorning his head. Others might wonder why an equestrian post worker's shirt was stretched across the dog's back, but all creatures who saw him noticed the manacles binding his ankles to a metal ball he carried in his brown sack. He would dutifully collect the mail from the train's ornery conductor and shuffle away, returning that night to place any outbound mail on the last train leaving the station. Few creatures ever bothered finding out the unfortunate soul's story, but those who knew it felt no remorse for the diamond dog that delivered their mail. A deserving fate for a criminal like him, they might say. Others had once spit on him. It never seemed to bother him. Nothing ever seemed to affect the dog until one fateful day that two lives were forever changed by a strange loophole in the equestrian postal system. Doug Diggum was asleep on his cot when the shrill scream of a train's whistle and the rumble of 100 freight cars woke him from his slumber. The morning train heralded the start of another day for the dog, his groans being drowned out by the squeal of brakes and slamming of buffers. Donning his cap and pulling the tiny shirt over his torso, he placed the brown leather pouch over his shoulders before picking up his ever-present weight and placing it into the pouch. The clank of his chains were the only sounds he was ever able to hear, or the noise of the train until it finally halted with the conductor's caboose sitting at the ramshackle platform the town considered a station. "Morning, Garf," Doug grunted as he stepped up the caboose and waited for the day's mail. The conductor, a plain-looking griffin with a scar over his right eye, promptly dumped a small batch of letters into the waiting mail pouch, where they settled snugly against a metal ball. 2 parcels and a cylinder followed after them. "See ya tomorrow," Doug growled as he turned to leave. "Hold it!" Garf hissed, stepping back into the caboose. He let out a small, cruel chuckle before calling from the inside. "Got one more package for ya." The clop of tiny hooves attracted Doug's attention. A small equestrian pony stepped out of the caboose and looked at Doug intently. From the angular structure of the pony's muzzle, Doug guessed that it was a colt, a young one at that. He was a dull blue with scraggly gray hair that looked like it had never been combed, but Doug didn't really care about that. The diamond dog was more focused on the card hanging from the colt's neck containing an address and a large number of stamps. "Mr. Bit, meet Mr. Diggum," Garf cackled from the doorway. "He's going to escort you to your aunt's house." The colt hesitantly stepped down to the station and held out a hoof to Doug. "It's a pleasure to meet you, sir," the colt squeaked out. Doug shot Garf a dirty look as he shook the colt's hoof. "You take care now, Mr. Bit. Don't let that mean old dog push you around." Garf laughed before he slammed the door to the caboose shut, although Doug could still hear him laughing from inside. The colt looked back at the caboose before he looked anxiously up at Doug with a nervous expression. "What did he mean by that?" the colt, Bit, if Doug heard Garf right, asked. Doug looked down with a frown. "He be making joke. He not very funny, though." Bit's nervousness faded and he even smiled a bit. "I didn't think he was being very funny, either." Doug leaned down and stared long and hard at the card hung around the colt's neck. Apparently the colt was addressed to a granite rock out in the mining camp. It was typically the last stop on his route. Well, that meant it would be a slightly longer trip than just going straight to the camp. There would be plenty of opportunities for the small colt to rest if he needed to. "Come," Doug ordered, and began walking. Bit promptly caught up with him and settled into a steady trot, looking all around him in wonder. Doug watched him out of the corner of his eye and noticed that the colt spent a lot of time staring at the manacles around his ankles. Whether it was out of fear or politeness, Bit didn't ask about the Diamond Dog's iron bracelets, and Doug didn't feel much like talking about them. It continued like this for quite some time. Doug would lead the colt through town, stopping in front of a rundown house or building and placing a few letters in the mailbox if there were any. The sound of Doug's manacles and the occasional whistle from a passing train was all that could be heard in what appeared to be a ghost town to the young colt, and he finally worked up the courage to ask. "Mr. Diggum?" "Hi," Doug grunted. "What?" Well," the colt looked around once more. "It's just, I don't see any pony. No one's here." "They digging," the Diamond Dog answered, as if that answered everything. "Digging?" Evidently, it did not. "Diamond Dog Town," Doug explained. "Dogs dig, house on top of hole. Whole town on top of big cave. Every dog be digging." "Oh," Bit looked down at the dirt. "What's that?" Doug shrugged. "It be, but dog do. Us like to dig." "Oh." Bit fell silent again and looked around for another conversation starter. A glance upwards reminded him of the sky, and he decided to switch subjects. "Those clouds sure look nasty," he remarked of the grey sky. "I sure hope it doesn't rain." "It never rain," Doug grumbled as he fumbled through the mail pouch for another letter. "Never shine, never rain, always grey. That way here called bad rock. It be bad day." "Oh," Bit said. It was quiet after that. It took nearly half the day for Doug to finish sorting the mail and deliver it at his slow, steady pace. Bit was remarkably patient for a colt his age, just following along and taking in the sight of the rural town. Once, the pair even met another Diamond Dog above the surface. Bit waved at him, but the dog took one look at Doug and merely hurried along on his way. Finally, Doug slammed the door shut on the last mailbox in town and checked his pouch. There was still a package and several letters, all bound for the mine, nestled in next to his bulb, but Doug was in no hurry. Turning to Bit, who was still faithfully right behind him, Doug spoke for the first time in hours. "Hungry?" "Huh?" Bit seemed startled by the question, but nodded after a brief moment. "Yeah, I'm a little bit hungry." "Come," Doug ordered tersely. "It'd be a long way to mine. You eat first." Bit fell in, trotting behind Doug to what looked like the town hall. Something illegible was written above the door, and Bit stopped to squint at it. "It's a food," Doug said as he opened the door. "I thought this was the town hall," Bit said sheepishly as they entered the building. "It was." Light filtered in from a few windows, and the rest of the interior was lit by a few lanterns. Tables and chairs were set up inside, along with a bar counter at one end. Doug picked Bit up and set him in a chair before approaching the bar counter and leaning over. The gaping hole behind the counter seemed to stretch downwards for miles, but Doug knew better and promptly barked. "Ruff! Ruff! Ruff!" The sound echoed down the hole and disappeared. Moments later, a series of higher-pitched yips and growls answered him before there was a scrabbling of paws on hardened dirt, and a golden-yellow Diamond Dog clanged up the sides of the hole. Goldie was comparatively small for a Diamond Dog, not fit for mining, and had instead opened up a small bar and restaurant for travelers and miners to relax in. Although unsuccessful in terms of finance, Goldie was able to keep a small menu and several drinks stocked at all times in the back room. As she climbed out of the hole and looked at Doug, she lashed into him with a series of growls and barks, explaining just how stupid Doug was for interrupting her. Well, Doug wasn't sure what he interrupted, but Goldie was mad for some reason. However, she fell silent when she saw Bit sitting at the table and looked at Doug for an explanation. Doug explained to her that Bit was essentially a package and pointed to the card with an address and stamps for proof. Satisfied Doug was telling the truth, Goldie approached Bit and knelt down. "Hello there, little one," she said in broken Equish. She was better than Doug, but still not perfect. "Are you hungry?" Bit nodded numbly, for some reason unable to talk. Goldie merely smiled and continued. "How about a hamburger? Got it fresh from Philadelphia yesterday." Oh, okay," Bit finally managed to gabble out. Goldie was quick in making the burger, and it was 5 minutes before the food was set in front of Bit, along with a glass of water, as anything else in the tavern was alcoholic. Bit eagerly dug into his meal, but paused after a few bites. "Isn't Mr. Diggum going to eat?" he asked. Goldie looked at Doug with pity and quickly changed the subject. "Tell me, little one," she said, "what brings you to Bad Rock?" Bit instantly brightened. "My aunt's out here. My mom and pop sent me out here while they get a new house," he explained. Goldie looked at him uncertainly, tilting her head questioningly. "Is it strange for you to be traveling by mail? And here?" Bit nodded, still smiling. "It's been really hard back home, and Mom and Pop had no money. It was cheaper to send me by mail, and I technically have a guardian the whole way. Anyways, I'm supposed to stay with my aunt at the mine until they write her a letter saying they've got the house." Goldie frowned at this, and Doug knew why. Even he thought it seemed strange. After a brief moment, Goldie gave a slight shrug and gave Bit a big smile. "Well, little one, if you're ever in town, stop by and I will make you a nice big meal," she said. Doug had not been lying when he said it was a long walk, easily taking 2 hours at their current pace. Outside of town, the wind picked up drastically. Bit was huddling behind Doug for quite a ways for protection, but eventually the diamond dog heard the colt's teeth begin to chatter. Even though Doug was not prone to showing any sort of emotion, he still felt sorry for Bit and promptly picked him up and set him in the leather pouch. The fabric did not offer much protection from the wind, but it was still something, and Doug's body heat was slowly leached over to the colt's shivering body. By the time they reached the mine, Bit had stopped shivering and was eager to be out of the pouch. The mine was little more than a large hole in the ground with several conveyor belts leading up to the ground to a railroad track where several hoppers were filled until they could be dumped into the train. The one side was a large building hastily put together by the mine's owners as a sort of headquarters. It was here that Doug would deliver letters and packages and let the mine owners do the rest. The influx of ponies and even a few griffins had led to a lot more letters and packages being sent to the mine, although today was rather light, save for Bit. Stepping through the door, a griffin looked up from the desk and hissed, "Leave the letters in the usual spot." Doug nodded, but stepped aside for Bit to enter. "Package for Granite Rock," he growled. The griffin gave a squawk of surprise and looked between the two of them, open-mouthed. Bit eagerly stepped forward and helpfully showed his card to the griffin. The griffin looked at it and then hissed angrily. "I don't know what kind of joke you're playing, but it isn't funny." "It's not a joke," Bit said. "My parents sent me out to meet my Aunt Granite. They said she runs the place." "I'm the owner of Bad Rock Mine," the griffin snapped. Then he stopped, realization dawning on his face. "Wait, have you ever met your aunt before?" he asked cautiously. Bit shook his head. "They told me she left before I was born." The griffin looked at Doug and motioned him over quickly. As soon as Doug was near enough for him to whisper, the griffin leaned over and spoke into Doug's ear. "Doug, something's fishy about this. There's no Granite Rock here. Never has been." Doug's own eyes widened at the implications, and he looked at Bit with worry. "What'd I do?" Doug whispered back. "Send him back!" the Griffin practically squawked. "I'll get in big trouble if the child's on the premises." "Parents moved," Doug whispered. "Can't help you," the Griffin said. "Good luck." Bit had realized something was wrong when the two grown-ups had started whispering, and when Doug ushered them outside, the colt looked about ready to cry. "Is something wrong?" he begged. "Did something happen?" Doug didn't know how to answer and instead began to walk back to Bad Rock. "Come, we go," he ordered tersely. "Mr. Digham, please," Bit cried. "What happened?" Doug didn't stop. He was afraid of what might happen if he did. Bit continued to call after him, dancing between following him and going back into the office. Finally, he turned around and began hammering on the door for the Griffin to let him in, screaming that he needed to know what happened. He didn't notice Doug's chain approaching and was taken by surprise when Doug picked him up and began to carry him away. The small colt's hooves beat against Doug's face and chest, but Doug didn't let go. Bit cried the entire time Doug carried him, eventually wearing himself out and falling asleep in the Diamond Dog's arms. Even in his sleep, the colt whimpered and shivered uncontrollably for some time before he finally calmed down. The clank of chains and the howl of the wind became the only sounds on the plains. For the first time in his life, Doug cried. Chapter 2 is not stopping. Doug strode into town with a small shag that passed at the post office. There, he laid the colt down at his own cot before walking to the front of the office and staring at the board mounted near the door. On it was a list of towns with prices next to them. Postage wasn't cheap this far out in the middle of nowhere, but sometimes it was worth the cost. "Mr. Digham?" Bit's voice, small and frightened, came from inside the shack. Doc walked into the door and stood there, sheepishly looking down at the sniffling Bit. "Mr. Digham?" Bit said. "What happened?" Doug would have traded his entire life away if it meant he didn't have to answer that question. But he was here, and there was no easy way out. "Your aunt, she was not there," Doug said slowly. "She never was." Bit's eyes moistened, but he didn't start crying, at least not yet. "So, what does that mean for me?" Doug looked around and saw a stamp that had never been used before. He reached over and picked it up before giving it to the colt. "Return to sender," Bit read aloud. The silence was deafening. It was almost a relief to hear the train whistle in the distance, and even more so when the train rumbled past and shook the entire shack. The train didn't last forever and eventually passed, leaving the two in silence once again. It was Bit who broke it, speaking out in a hushed voice. "Somehow, I knew it was too good to be true," he whispered, just barely loud enough to hear. "The yelling stopped, the fighting, the hate. It just stopped. Suddenly, Mom and Pop were smiling, telling me it was going to get better. I was going to leave, and they'd come get me when it was all better. I knew they were lying, but I wanted to believe them. Why did they have to lie?" Doug didn't have an answer, so Bit asked again, the tears beginning to flow. "They could have told me. Why lie to me? Why send me so far away? Was I that bad of a colt?" The Diamond Dog didn't know how to respond, and so he picked up the colt and hugged him close while sitting down on the cot. "Why does nobody want me?" Bit cried into Doug's shoulder. "Why was I even born if not even my own parents wanted me?" Doug made soft growls as he stroked the back of the colt, trying to calm him like he had seen a mother calm her baby. "Bit, bad things happen," Doug began. "But you have to keep going. Keep going. It will get better." "You can't know that!" Bit yelled, squeezing his eyes shut as he slammed a hoof against Doug's shoulder. "What would you know? You're just a mail pony. I don't even know what you are." Doug let Bit hit him a few more times, each of the colt's punches weaker than the last. "Bit, I tell you a story," Doug said, placing Bit on the cot to his side and reaching down. Bit watched as he pulled up a metal ball attached to the chain that ran to his ankles. "Your chain?" the colt whimpered. "It's not always there," Doug said. "A young once, and free. Many years ago, I was digging far and finding shinies. 2 dogs with me, best friends. One day, I find white pony. She find best shinies. We tried to take her, but she escaped." "You try to kidnap her?" Bit asked, horrified. Doug nodded sadly. "I bad dog, and I pay for bad." Bit looked at the ball and chain. "You're a prisoner?" Nodding again, Doug reached under the cot and pulled out a picture frame. "When King Dirt learn we take pony, he angry. He stay, we start war with ponies maybe. My friends go to Griffinland. Me, I get caught. I punished." Bit looked at the frame and was surprised to see it written in equestrian. Taking hold of it, he began to read aloud. "I, King Dirtmover, hereby find thee, Doug Diggum, to be guilty of treason. From this day forth, you shall serve as a post dog until your dying day." Bit looked at Doug with scared eyes. "You're never able to leave?" Doug took the frame and placed it back under the bed. "Maybe. I still young. Maybe someday King change mind. Someday I dig again." "Have you ever tried to escape?" Bit asked. "Once," Doug said, picking his ball and chain again. "Magic. No escaping. No money. No food. Only mail." "No food?" Bit asked. "Wouldn't you starve?" Doug merely pointed to the ball. "Magic." Bit looked down at the stamp and sniffed. "I guess you got it pretty bad, huh?" "No. You rock bottom. Me okay," Doug said. "But you keep going, okay? Just like me. One day, it get better." Bit looked up at him, and even though he was still crying, he was smiling. "Okay, I'll keep going." Doug took the stamp from him and set it back on the shelf. Shuffling over to a corner of the room, he picked up the floorboard and reached inside. The moment he grabbed a handful of gems laying in the hole, his ball and chain lit up with a burning light. Searing pain jolted up his legs, and he yelped at the feeling. "Mr. Diggum!" Bit ran to help, but Doug pushed him away. Okay, Doug yipped. He quickly placed the bits in a metal tray next to a register-looking device, and the light died out as well as the pain. Bit looked at the ball and chain in fear, but moved to help Doug. "What happened?" he asked as he checked to see if there was any damage to Doug's legs. "No money," Doug said before pulling the lever on the side of the register. The tray of gems dipped into the machine, and there was a grinding noise before it spat out a set of stamps. Doug took them and began placing them over the stamps already on Bit's address card. "What are you doing?" Bit asked. Doug finished placing the stamps on the card and began looking for the quill the post office had been given. "You go, new home," he said. "Pony Town. They take good care of you." Upon finding the quill, he crossed out the address of the mining complex and wrote, "Pony Town Orphanage." "But I want to stay with you," Bit protested. "No money, no food, no you," Doug answered firmly. "What about Goldie then?" Bit asked. "What if I stay with her and work in the town?" "She more poor than me," Doug said. "You go, but visit someday." Bit tried to protest, but Doug held up his hand. "You visit?" The colt's words died on his lips, and he mutely nodded. He began to tear up again, but was suddenly wrapped in a bear hug by Doug. "You keep going. Someday, I go too." The evening's train whistle shrieked, and the engine yanked forwards, straining against the heavy load trailing a mile behind. The caboose felt the jolt moments later, slowly beginning to move out of the station. Bit stood on the rear railing, waving to Doug as the train slowly picked up speed. Doug stood on the platform, waving to Bit. For the first time in a long time, he smiled. The end.